Was this the week that changed the election? We talked to the man that invented the swingometer, David Butler, who tells me he's never seen anything like it.
Anything may happen, but the movement of opinion recorded in the polls is a bigger movement than has occurred in any previous election.
And our panel is back to make sense of an extraordinary 7 days. Donald Trump's time abroad comes to a close, but just what's awaiting him at home with the Russia investigation?
It would be a terrible thing if someone who is President of the United States knowingly profited off laundering money for criminals. It'd be even worse if the President of the United States business profited off laundering money for the Russian state. It is not the same.
And divided Britain. Katie Razzle looks at the fault lines on the question of Scottish independence.
I would hate to separate from the UK.
I'm quite happy to be part of the British Isles, just not the UK.
Well, you hadn't really got the choice unless you got a really big hammer drill.
Hello, good evening. Remember those heady days when the election seemed boring? When we were sick of the stage-managed, unwavering adjectives on offer? Many feared the electoral outcome had already been written on something more permanent than the fated Edstone. But this week shattered all of that. This was the script no one wrote, a week that began with a monumental U-turn, soon forgotten in the torment of Manchester's attack. And from its wake, a campaign that emerged refocused on national security and on foreign policy. Well, a poll today showed Labour slashing the Conservative lead to 5 points. We'll be speaking to David Butler in a moment, the psephologist who has seen more from the front line of electoral history here than anyone else alive. So is this a question of voters genuinely changing their minds, of rogue polls, or of a nation too shattered to know what it thinks right now? David Grossman has our first report.
Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed.
Has she done another U-turn, Jeremy?
Apparently, yes. Apparently.
Oh, blimey, you can't trust
At the beginning of the week, the election looked very different. Theresa May's unprecedented manifesto U-turn on social care was dominating the headlines, and Labour was sensing an opportunity. And then it might appear unseemly, callous even, to ask what impact the dreadful events in Manchester will have on the general election campaign. But it's undeniable the campaign was interrupted, and it's now restarted, but refocused on new themes, on security, on terrorism. It's also undeniable that how we see our party leaders is partly informed by how they respond to profound events, the solutions they offer. It's the stuff of politics. It's what elections are all about. Restarting campaigning today, Jeremy Corbyn gave his assessment of the lessons of the Manchester attack. He said Labour would reverse police cuts, and he also outlined what he saw as some of the causes of terrorism.
Many experts, including professionals in our intelligence and security services, have pointed out the connections between wars that we've been involved in or supported and fought in other countries, such as Libya, and terrorism here at home. That assessment in no way reduces the guilt of those who attack our children. An informed understanding of the causes of terrorism is an essential part of an effective response that will protect the security of our people.
At the end of his speech, Mr Corbyn declined to take any questions and then made a dash for the back door. However, later he faced a grilling on the BBC from Andrew Neil.
They're targeting young girls at a pop concert because they hate our values. They said they hate secular liberal societies. It's not foreign policy.
I agree they hate those liberal values. They hate the idea of women being able to enjoy themselves and all the liberal values. And that was the whole point of my speech this morning. We've got to defend our liberal values.
But where's the foreign policy? I mean, what was the foreign policy of Sweden that resulted in Sweden being attacked?
The foreign policy issue has to be, for all of us, what is happening in a number of countries where we have intervened.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister was in Sicily at the G7 summit, working, she said, with our international partners to fight terrorism.
At the same time, Jeremy Corbyn has said that terror attacks in Britain are our own fault, and he's chosen to do that just a few days after one of the worst terrorist atrocities we have experienced in the United Kingdom. And I want to make one thing very clear to Jeremy Corbyn and to you, and it is that there can never, ever be an excuse for terrorism.
But what impact, if any, is this having on the polls? A YouGov poll immediately after Theresa May called the election in April had the Tories sitting on a 24-point lead. The latest poll, conducted after the Manchester attack, has the lead shrunk to just 5 points.
So far, based on the evidence that we've seen, it doesn't seem as though it's yet had a big impact. I mean, certainly anything that moves the conversation in the direction of terrorism, national security, or perhaps even defence, may benefit the Conservatives, because from polling before Manchester, it was clear that they had quite a big lead in that area, but there doesn't seem to be an impact from that yet. The bigger impact so far seems more to be from the social care and the impact that that's had on the Conservatives.
There's absolutely no guarantee that something like this, a big event, big national security emergency, helps the incumbent government. In Spain, it had the opposite effect, although there were very specific issues there around how the government had handled it. And this cuts both ways. I mean, for the opposition as well, if they are seen, if Labour is seen too quickly to be trying to pile in and attack the government, that could rebound onto Labour.
But there is now another interruption in the campaign for the bank holiday weekend. By the time the population goes back to work on Tuesday, will politics still be dominated by security and terrorism issues, or will it be something else?
David Grossman there. Well, David Butler, Sir David Butler, is to psephology what Shakespeare is to dramaturgy, a veteran who's seen elections come and go since the 1950s. Today he told me this movement of opinion in the polls was a bigger one than had occurred in any previous election. Over drinks this afternoon, we discussed those latest polls, the effect of the Manchester bombing, and whether we could be dealing with a shy Tory or a shy Labour phenomenon, making the numbers tricky.
We are the Sultans. We are the Sultans.
And you, David Butler, are a psephologist. What does it mean?
It means a student of elections. I'm afraid that it's an awful, silly academic joke which somebody else perpetrated and I put in print about 8 years ago. It now hangs like an albatross around my neck.
So, David, how do you see this election campaign in terms of the many that you've been through?
Well, it's very different from any one before. I'm rather glad that I'm not writing about it as I have written about virtually every election since 1945. This time, what happened in Manchester transforms things, and it seems to be having a great impact on the opinion polls. The election came unexpectedly, but when it came, it looked like a very expedient thing done by the Conservatives, looking to a large majority. They may still get a large majority, but it doesn't look likely to be nearly as big as they had expected.
Do you think that the events in Manchester will have an impact on the ultimate result?
I can't think that they won't. They seem already to have done it in the opinion polls, to have made a difference to expectations, and they may make a bigger difference, but there may be a swing back. Anything may happen, but the movement of opinion recorded in the polls is a bigger movement than has occurred in any previous election.
So you have never seen this bigger swing, if you like, from one party to another during a campaign?
No, there have been movements and late swings helped the Conservatives on a couple of occasions.
Is your sense that the change of policy or the policy on dementia tax has really upset people?
Something has happened out there. We should have to wait and see. I've not been very cautious in the past about making predictions, but I'm far more cautious now than ever before. It obviously looks like a Conservative victory because they're still ahead in the polls, and they would win if the party votes were level. The Conservatives would win in seats. So it's not, the Conservatives needn't despair, but the Labour Party can obviously feel much happier now than at any point in the last 3 weeks.
How do U-turns play out generally?
Well, there haven't been major U-turns. The U-turn last week was a bigger U-turn than I can recall at any election since 1945.
Does it feel to you that we've gone back to a two-party system now?
Well, to a large extent, we couldn't say that because of Scotland. And Northern Ireland, of course, is quite outside the scene. So we have to talk about England and Wales. And that, I think, will still show, as past elections have, relatively uniform swings, relatively much the same in one place and another. It is interesting how in past elections swing has been surprisingly uniform. When you've got 10 seats in, you could predict the final result without great inaccuracy in all the elections I've been doing on television.
So in England and Wales then, the swingometer is very much alive and well?
Certainly, I would agree.
And is there a moment or is there a seat that you will be looking out for in particular on the night?
I think we'll know the result by midnight. If the results come out, if there were a dozen seats declared between 10:50 when the first seat got out last time and midnight, if we've got a dozen seats then, I think you have a pretty good idea of what's happening and whether the odd things the polls are suggesting are actually happening or not.
I hope you're wrong, because we've got a long night of work ahead of us after midnight.
I never found the nights long. I'm perfectly happy to sit up, and I shall be this time, to sit up all night watching the results and modifying.
If Jeremy Corbyn wins this election, what will be the magnitude of the challenge that he has overcome?
Oh, it would be overwhelming in terms of both the swing in votes he's achieved, but also, of course, the programme and the things that he has said that he would do. I think it would be an enormous switch, would have great repercussions in the markets and elsewhere if he were to win. It is a very key election, and the alternative outcomes, Conservative victory, Labour victory, are more extremely different than at any election in my lifetime.
You've recently joined Twitter, where everything has to be said in 140 characters.
Yeah.
If you had to sum up your election prediction in 140 characters, or thereabouts, what would it be?
Oh, I think it would be the Conservatives will win, but not by nothing like the margin that they were expecting to win by 2 weeks ago.
So, David, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It's round about 140, who's counting. So on June the 9th, will we look back and think this was the week that changed everything? Or will this have been a momentary blip, albeit in tragic circumstances, that actually did very little to shift people's voting opinions? Let's ask our panel. Paul Mason, Guardian columnist and a Labour supporter, former colleague. Ian Dale is a Conservative broadcaster and the managing director of Bite Back Publishing. And down the line from Salford, Jennifer Williams is the political editor of the Manchester Evening News. It's great to have you all. And Jennifer, I'm going to start with you because this is a completely different campaign, or at least it feels that, to the one that we were expecting. And campaigning has come back with a vengeance now. Does it feel like Manchester is ready for that to resume at this sort of level?
I think in Manchester, I'm not sure people are necessarily particularly focusing on the general election campaign now. I think as the campaign kicks back on, I suppose it started again with UKIP yesterday. It's easy to think that that we're just back into the swing of things again, but in Manchester it's been 4 days, and people aren't yet in a position to really process the information. So, I mean, we're still a city in shock. And I certainly I can only really speak from a personal perspective, it feels very soon to be back into electioneering again.
Too soon?
Well, from a personal perspective, somebody who lives in Manchester, yeah, it does feel too soon. I mean, I spoke to a few senior Labour people around here before I came out this evening, and their opinion on Jeremy Corbyn's timing and the content of his speech varied from poor to crass to livid was one of the messages that I got back, particularly on the timing, although a lot of people were disagreeing on the content and analysis of it as well.
Paul?
I feel it's very soon to be back into it. And I think we in politics and journalism have a tendency to think, well, you know, this attack, this warlike, murderous attack on our country was an interruption into something more important, which is the election. And many, not just in Manchester, all over the country, people are feeling that the important thing is the war we're in. Now, I think that...
The war?
the war. We're in a war with IS, and people realise that we're up against an enemy that wants to kill little girls. And, you know, every family, everybody sitting around the television and the table is thinking about that. And in that sense, it is very unfortunate that we've had to restart the election. And yet, you know, you cannot avoid the national security implications. Labour in no way can sit there and avoid when Conservative Central Office tweets tonight that Jeremy Corbyn is on the side of our enemies. I mean, if he's on the side of our enemies, he shouldn't be in Parliament. Of course, he is not on the side of our enemies. And I think that the weird thing is, what we all need to do is to avoid jumping the shark. We need to avoid raising this in this acute moment of kind of national mourning into a position where everybody turns around and starts going, it's you're the one.
Do you take that on board, and do you think it's the Conservatives that actually have politicised something that was just the restart of the campaign?
It's a really odd situation where I read Jeremy Corbyn's speech, and apart from some of the foreign policy bit, I could have delivered it myself. I could have said virtually all that Paul said there. And it does seem odd when, in an election, it is a bare-knuckle fight. It ought to be a bare-knuckle fight. It's about the future of our country. It's about the future of our democracy. And I think all parties are now going to have to be very careful about the tone that they set. And some people say, well, the Conservatives have gone overboard in their attack on Jeremy Corbyn today. Maybe.
Do you think so?
I think it was unfortunate that he said what he said about foreign policy in his speech. I think that could have waited. But Labour had to get on the front foot because this week, when there's a national emergency, the Prime Minister gets all the airtime. It's natural that happens. The opposition always find it difficult to then get on the front foot. So Jeremy Corbyn was right to try and get on the front foot this morning. His advisers were right for him to make that speech, but they misjudged some of the tone of it.
Jen, do you sense that people... I register what you're saying about it being too soon, but do you think there is, in his message, something that will bring a lot of people with him?
Yeah, potentially, but I think at the moment, I think it's probably too early to say. I mean, campaigning hasn't really properly started again in earnest, so no one's really been out on the doors yet. We don't really know how people are feeling. We don't really know how people will respond to that. I mean, to come back to what I was saying earlier on about it being 4 days, I mean, 4 days ago, Jeremy Corbyn was standing on a stage with Amber Rudd in Albert Square in Manchester, and the whole point of it was that it was a non-political occasion where people were not grandstanding, they were not making political points, and that was not the purpose of it. And that, I think, was received very well by Manchester. It was politicians together, paying their respects, showing that they cared about this and they understood the magnitude of it, but that they weren't using it as a platform.
Paul,
and I think it's yet to be seen how people will respond to political points being made a few days later.
I'm very interested to try and get a sense, and you'll be able to shed some light, Paul, on the kind of conversations that are going on in Labour HQ now. Is this people saying to Jeremy Corbyn, you know, you've got to go out there, you've got to start sort of taking the election back, or was there a difficulty, or what?
No, I mean, they know they're the underdogs from beginning to end. And incidentally, I think inside Labour HQ, there are some parts of Labour HQ that do not have conversations with other parts of Labour HQ. But insofar as the Corbyn team, they've always known that they're underdogs. They've always had the strategy to make people, to want people to talk about the kind of country you want to live in after Brexit.
Are they still feeling like underdogs with today's polls?
Yeah, because, I mean, Labour's problem electorally, to get cephalogical with you, is that all its votes pile up in the wrong places. So you can be on 38-40, which is an amazing position. I mean, Ed Miliband would have killed for 40%, but it can all be in Labour strongholds. So they know about that. But what they wanted at the beginning was for this not to be about Brexit. Now, because of a very unfortunate fact, it is no longer about Brexit.
Ian, let me ask you the same question, because you're talking to a lot of people. Are they wobbling now? Is there a fear?
Oh, there is a wobble going on, absolutely. There are people who think that the last 10 days have been a disaster for the Conservatives. I mean, not necessarily the last few days, but certainly the lead up to this, with the U-turn
or
on
the policy itself.
Well, both, because it wasn't a well-thought-out policy. It's quite clear. Everybody can see that. And believe it or not, there are parts of Conservative campaign headquarters that don't talk to other parts.
So is Nick Timothy getting the blame for that, or is Linton Crosby getting the blame, or who's putting
I think
fingers
from
there?
Conservative MPs or ex-MPs, Conservative candidates, they are blaming Nick Timothy for that. Now, I'm not sure, in the end, the buck has to stop with Theresa May, but there are a lot of unhappy people about how this manifesto was, unhappy about how it was drawn up and some of the policies in it. And if you think about it, we were talking about this last week, there's nothing eye-catching in it, and the eye-catching bit has gone wrong.
Jen, do you think that people will look at this week of the election and say this is when everything changed? And clearly you're speaking tonight, you know, first and foremost as a Manchester citizen, but with your sort of political editor hat on. Do you think this will be the week when the election changed, or do you think it will be sort of sucked into the overall campaign and people will revert to normal?
I think it's inevitably going to change the narrative of it, isn't it? I mean, if at the start of the week people were talking about the dementia tax and social care, you know, at the end of the week we're talking about ISIS and security and so on. I think it's just inevitable, that it's going to change.
Do you think that will last? I mean, do you think?
Well, it's only 2 weeks, isn't it, to go? So.
It's really difficult to say because we all thought that the Joe Cox murder in the referendum was a game changer. I certainly thought, well, that's it for Leave, because however it pans out, people will somehow associate the person that did this with Leave. Now, it didn't work out like that. So I think it's very difficult to sit here now, 12 days out from the election, and say, well, this is what's going to happen. I think the Conservatives are going to make this a presidential campaign. They will try and get Brexit back onto the agenda. Remember, that's what this election was supposed to be all about, and it hasn't been. We haven't. David Davis was supposed to make a big speech on that today. Now, he didn't, I assume, because they didn't want to deflect attention from Jeremy Corbyn.
Paul, do you think it's going to... Do you think these polls, first of all, reflect where Labour is now and how well they could do?
I've always thought that it would be relatively easy for Labour to get to about 35 with a very radical programme, both on national security and on economics. Beyond that, you have to start...
Better than Ed Miliband.
That's why I'm a Corbyn supporter. But beyond that, it's a question of building alliances in the centre. And the really striking thing about the poll of polls graph that you showed is the total squeeze of everybody else. This has become, amazingly, about red versus blue.
Right. And that's why we had the swingometer himself.
The swing matters, for once.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks a lot. Now, in a week when all eyes have been here on domestic news, it's easy to forget the extraordinary narrative unfolding in America. Today it emerged that President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is under scrutiny by the FBI as part of its probe into Russia ties. Excuse me. He's being investigated because of meetings held in December with the Russian ambassador, amongst others. Now, the twist comes as former director of the FBI, James Comey, is himself due to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was fired, you'll remember, earlier this month by Donald Trump as he was trying to look into allegations of collusion between Trump and Russia during the election. Well, the president's facing claims he tried to interfere in the investigation. Some are starting to talk of impeachment. Our correspondent Paul Wood has broken several key developments in this story. Reports now on the state of play in Washington.
What do I have to get involved with Putin for? I have nothing to do with Putin. I've never spoken to him. I don't know anything about him. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails. The entire thing has been a witch hunt, and there is no collusion.
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on with Trump and Russia? So far, there's precious little evidence, only a deluge of questions. Trump denies it all. The central allegation against President Trump is that his campaign colluded with Russia to hack leading Democrats during the election.
The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God.
There are now 5 separate congressional inquiries into Trump and Russia. The former director of the CIA spoke to one.
It should be clear to everyone that Russia brazenly interfered in our 2016 presidential election process, and that they undertook these activities despite our strong protests and explicit warning that they not do so.
That is the unified judgment of all the US intelligence agencies. I first heard about Russia interfering in the US election process in early 2016. One of Donald Trump's Republican opponents sent me to meet someone who'd retired from the US intelligence community.
You know, this former spy said to me, we've just had a recording from one of our allies which shows the Russians trying to help Donald Trump in the election.
Whether that recording or any recording like it really exists is the subject of the many investigations into what relationship the Trump campaign had with the Kremlin. But it is the bedrock assumption of these investigations that the Russians did interfere in the election, and they did it to elect President Trump. But was there collusion? The focus is now on the former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, the former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, Trump's friend, Roger Stone, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. What did the president's men actually do? Ted Context saw many of the top-secret transcripts of Trump's people talking to the Russians. He sounds a note of skepticism. You had the top classified clearances, and you saw many of the intercepts that are now the subject of fierce speculation in Washington. Was there any evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia that you saw?
No. From the things that I saw, there is nothing like that, and nor would you expect there to be. I mean, people are not that stupid. I mean, the Russians know we're listening and others know we're listening. So if you're going to do something terribly nefarious, you're not going to publicize it.
That's a problem for Trump's critics, who include many in his own party. There have been a string of intelligence chiefs coming to committee hearings saying they have seen no evidence of collusion. Would it not have emerged by now if it was there?
I have not seen a string of them coming before the committee saying there's no collusion. I have not observed that. There is, they've said that it's had no effect on the election, but they didn't say that there's no collusion. I think that's the reason why we're having these investigations. That's why you have a special prosecutor.
Another key allegation is that Russian criminals laundered money through Trump businesses, and that led to a relationship with Russian intelligence.
About 13 years ago, I was billions of dollars in debt.
As Trump told viewers of his show, The Apprentice, he bounced back. But how? His businesses had gone bankrupt 4 times. Who would loan to him? Congressional investigators are trying to find out if it was the Russians. They're trying to find out who owns apartments in Trump buildings. Often the real ownership is hidden under layers of shell companies. The working assumption is that the Russian mafia and the Russian state are often the same thing. Trump denies any wrongdoing. Jonathan Weiner was one of the US government's leading experts on money laundering.
It would be a terrible thing if someone who was President of the United States knowingly profited off laundering money for criminals. It'd be even worse if the President of the United States business profited off laundering money for the Russian state. It is not the safety, stability, security of the American people. It is the advancement of the policies and goals of an adversary, and a serious adversary over a long time. So if that happened, that's something we need to know about, and the people involved need to be held accountable.
President Trump also faces claims that Russian intelligence filmed him with prostitutes, and so he's vulnerable to blackmail.
What are you looking for in this year's next Miss Universe?
Well, we have a lot. We have as good as I've ever seen in terms of beauty. The beauty is amazing.
It was during the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow that the blackmail tape was supposedly made. Trump is alleged to have paid prostitutes to urinate on a bed used by the Obamas on a state visit. That incendiary claim was made by a former MI6 spy, Christopher Steele. I was one of the first journalists to get a look at his now famous dossier back in October. The White House calls Steele's dossier fake news. The president's supporters say he's a germaphobe who'd never behave this way. The president himself said, of course he knew there'd be cameras in his Moscow hotel room. There remains no proof that the Kremlin does have a Trump sex tape. Still, even before the Steele dossier was published, I heard from 2 different sources that the Russians had compromat or compromising material. It's possible that all these separate sources of information can be traced back ultimately to the Russian intelligence services. If so, how to interpret the leak? It could be a warning, this is what we have on you, or it could be what the Russians call provokatsiya, a provocation or lie designed to confuse people, something to inoculate Mr. Trump against all the other allegations he faces. The president's critics say he acts as if the Kremlin does have a hold over him. Here he is with Russia's foreign minister and ambassador. No, say his supporters, this is the behaviour of a man with nothing to hide. The most deadly charge against Trump concerns his actions as president. Did he tell the then FBI director James Comey to kill the Russia investigation?
There's James. He's become more famous than me.
Trump greets Comey, Godfather style, with a kiss on the cheek.
I know it was you, Fredo. You broke my heart.
Just a few months before he sacked him. The former FBI director has apparently claimed this was done because he refused to pledge loyalty to the president. Trump has reportedly called Comey a nutjob. Comey is now to testify to Congress.
One thing that we know about Jim Comey is that he has a flair for the dramatic, and he has, in previous open testimonies in Congress, sort of spun dramatic stories about his role in things. And so I can certainly see what's coming is a dramatic moment where Comey lays out his side of events and his interactions with Trump, and then we'll see where the investigators go from there.
Obstruction of justice was the first charge in the articles of impeachment against President Nixon. The lesson of Watergate, it's the cover-up that always gets you, not the original crime. People are saying things privately that they are not saying publicly. There's a lot of discussion about impeachment. Is that just the Democrats, or is this both sides of the aisle now?
Of course, there are conversations going on. The people allude to them. You don't know exactly who's in those conversations. I've heard around town, I have no idea if there's any truth in it, that there's a talk about a grand deal where Pence becomes president, but there's a conversation with the Democrats about what would be in the agenda, that everybody pulls, if it had to come to this, that everybody understands that the country is in a constitutional crisis, which we are.
The president's defenders say that is pure fantasy.
Look at the way I've been treated lately.
To official Washington, it's very suspicious, but official Washington hasn't liked Donald Trump from the day he declared. He's an honest man, and I think basically he's going to be discovered to be an honest man. He'll probably be the most investigated president since Richard Nixon, but don't look at a guy when he's down and out. Look at him over the long run, and over the long run, Donald Trump will, I think, transcend his enemies.
Trump's supporters say he's the victim of a conspiracy within the intelligence agencies to overturn the election result. His enemies believe he was long ago bought or blackmailed by the Kremlin. No evidence of that has yet emerged, but it would be a bitter irony for the president if he were brought down not by something in his past, but by his efforts to fight the accusations.
Paul Wood there. Now let's bring you back to this election. How do we know what really matters to people? The old certainties are gone, tribal loyalties shattered, some of them by the Brexit vote. People are less likely to vote blindly for the party of their parents, and factors such as age, geography and education are emerging now as the new dividing lines. Over the course of the campaign, Katie Razzle's looking at some of these divisions in 21st century Britain's voting habits in some detail. For tonight's report, she travelled from East Renfrewshire in Glasgow to examine where the fault lines lie on the issue of Scottish independence.
We're going to meet a mayor who gave birth a couple of days ago.
Conservative used to be a dirty word in Scotland.
Oh, look. That is the sweetest thing I think I've ever seen.
The party was branded one of horse-riding, game-shooting toffs with vast estates. Bożena Biankowska isn't that. though this East Renfrewshire farmer does ride her much-loved horses and has voted Tory in the past. She wants Scotland to stay part of the UK.
Does this issue divide people, divide families?
Very much so. Very much so. Within the family, we're deeply divided. During the last referendum, I knew people that sold their houses and moved back to England because of the hostility. We all have different opinions, but my brother Chris seems to be the most passionate about it. So if you'd like to speak to him, we can call each other idiots.
A recent YouGov poll found this election 9 out of 10 voters who don't want independence will opt for a party that shares that view. 3/4 of yes voters will vote SNP, like older brother Chris.
Once Scotland is independent, it has its own future in its hands. No, when it is, it's a matter of time.
No, absolutely if. I've no interest in independence, and I'm really glad they voted against it. But it was a silent majority. Most of us didn't want to speak up in case because you just get a tirade of abuse.
At the time we lost the vote, I was quite happy to leave it 5-10 years until the Scottish population moved again towards independence, so there was no immediate rush to have one. But the thing of being taken out of the EU against the wishes of the Scottish people, who voted 62% for staying in the EU, meant that the independence vote should happen again.
Do you want a second referendum?
I didn't want Brexit, and I certainly don't want a second referendum. We've already voted. We voted to stay. That's it. And because the politicians are very loud, and it's the ticket that they've been running with, they can't exactly put it down, because what's the point of the SNP if they don't have independence?
Who do you believe, which political party do you believe will safeguard the union?
Tory, definitely. I love being part of the UK. I would hate to separate from the UK.
I'm quite happy to be part of the British Isles, just not the UK.
Well, you haven't really got the choice unless you've got a really big hammer drill.
East Renfrewshire is a Tory and Labour target seat. It was Labour's from 1997 and is the SNP's now. It's only 3 years since the independence referendum, with another one mooted and creating tensions. On the nationalist side, the no vote brought about the overwhelming SNP triumph at the last general election. This time round, there's a sense that unionists may want to send a message, and that could benefit the party that's spent decades in the Scottish political wilderness. In the polling done since the last general election, though the SNP is still way in front, its trajectory has been downwards. The Conservatives, from a low base, have seen a steady rise. The party's nearly doubled its vote share, mainly at the expense of Scottish Labour.
The problem is, for me and for a lot of people like me, if you're not going to vote for SNP, I'm not terribly sure who you are going to vote for.
Gordon Canning's a member of East Renfrewshire's Mearns Golf Academy. He used to vote Labour. But efforts by the Scottish Conservatives to ensure they are seen as the party most in favour of the union appear to have cut through.
Could you ever bring yourself to vote for them?
Yeah.
Is that a difficult thing to say in Scotland?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult thing for someone who's never voted Tory before to say that they may vote for Tory. But yeah.
And what's that about? Why would you? Why might you?
Why might I? Because I want the SNP to be aware that there are a large number of people in Scotland who do not want another independence referendum. And the reasons for bringing it using Brexit as an excuse for another independence referendum, I think is unfair.
The Conservatives haven't necessarily been the most positive brand in Scotland for the last few decades. Do you think that's changing?
It is changing, yeah.
Why do you think it's changing?
Well, because Labour is no longer a credible opposition. And I think that's perhaps the main reason.
Which means people are more willing to vote Conservative?
Yes.
And have you ever voted Conservative before?
Once, probably 40 years ago. Not here.
And how do you usually vote, if you don't mind my asking?
Lib Dem.
And will you vote for them this time?
No.
Why not?
Because I want to vote tactically to try and keep the SNP out.
12 miles away, Glasgow is nationalist heartland. The city voted yes in 2014, and all its seats went SNP at the last general election. But at this month's local elections, even here the Conservatives won some council seats.
Well, I found it strange because I don't know if you noticed in the news last week, but in the East End of Glasgow we elected Tory councillors. Can you believe that? Conservative councillors get in. And I have to be honest with you, it's quite impressive that the place that has the lowest life expectancy in Western Europe decided we needed to punish ourselves more.
Chrissy Ross compares Comedy Night at the Yes Bar, renamed in the run-up to the independence vote.
Although we have a very inclusive culture in Scotland, we have a very divided one at times as well. Especially, I wouldn't say it's along sectarian lines, it's definitely not. It is very much pro or anti-union lines that it's drawn across.
Do you feel that flag-waving nationalism on both sides is sort of infusing the debate more and more here?
Well, it's definitely made it become more entrenched. People are now taking a position where they feel they can't come back from, which I don't think is healthy for debate. There also seems to be a problem where people see themselves as one or the other. There's no shades of grey. Yeah, I'll probably be voting SNP, and it's mainly because I view myself as European and I'm a little bit dismayed at the fact we're leaving the EU.
1, 2. Repeat the spin twice.
At Glasgow's Grand Old Opry, plenty are in step with the SNP's vision. But from those who dance to the Union tune, a sense perhaps of why, even in the city Labour dominated for so long, the party has lost its way.
I'm from an area of Glasgow where Shettleston, which voted for a Conservative councillor, it's never been Conservative in my lifetime as far as I know. It's always been Labour, then it went SNP. So things have changed just locally recently.
You've voted Labour and Lib Dem in the past. Could you ever vote Conservative, do you think?
Possibly. As I said earlier, I haven't made up my mind how I'm going to vote.
But it is the union that you'll be thinking about.
That's a big piece. I would like to vote Labour because I predominantly have. I've got a nagging doubt about Jeremy Corbyn and some of his allies in the back of my mind.
The divisions in Scotland may still be focused around the question of independence, but the SNP's dominance this election still appears unassailable across much of the country. The latest YouGov poll puts the party on 42%. But unless Labour can turn its fortunes around, unlike in 2015, the Nationalists' main challenger this time is a revived Conservative Party.
Katie Razzle with that on Divided Britain. Now, before we go, NASA's Juno probe has just delivered these rather dramatic images of Jupiter's South Pole, complete with Earth-sized cyclones and its own Northern Light-style aurora. Good night.